No. Classical novels do not become meaningful just because we preserve them carefully. They become meaningful when new societies can actually see themselves inside them. And today we stand for a world where the dominant norm is experimental adaptations over true to novel adaptations. And in my speech today, there'll first be a few points of framing, and then I'll move on to my 2 points. Number one, about increasing cross-cultureness, and number two, deeper intersections of humanity. First, on framing then, let's be clear about what we're saying. Number one, we are not arguing that faithful adaptations should disappear. We're not saying that the original book has no value, and we are not saying that every experimental adaptation is automatically brilliant, right? What we are saying is that when people adapt classical novels into film, theater, TV, or other forms of media, the default norm should be that creators are encouraged to meaningfully reinterpret the story, to change like the setting, the perspective, themes, etc., in order to make the story speak to a different cultural and political context. And why does this matter? It matters because classical novels were never universally in a vacuum, right? They're written under in particular countries, in particular centuries, under particular gender roles, class systems, racial
Point of
hierarchies, and
information.
moral expectations. So if we treat that exact original context as the only legitimate way to tell the story, then over time the work becomes less like living culture and more like a historical object behind a glass, right? And so our side would like to say that let different societies take the same emotional conflict, the same moral tension, and the same political question and locate it inside their own world. We think this is how literature travels, and this is how literature survives. So what does our world look like? Our world is one where when adapting a classical novel, creators are rewarded for asking, number one, what does the story mean and what does the story mean here? What does the story mean now, and whose experience was missing in the first time, right? So instead of just reproducing the old setting, the old assumptions, artists use the source material as a foundation for new cultural conversations.
Point of
I would
information.
say that the winning metric, sorry, later, metric today is more socially meaningful and more culturally alive, right? Now moving on, before I move on to my points, I'll take a POI. 3, 2, 1, no POI.
Yeah, sorry. So my POI was that I do acknowledge that the info slide and the topic says to change core values and themes, and thus I would say that this is more of a transformation rather than an interpretation.
So we would like to say that the transformation or interpretation of like a film or like the change of media from the original obviously has the base of like the original, right? The intent or the main storyline is still there. What we are changing, for example, like I said in my characterization, is probably the inherently oppressed views because of the previous century being like raised as they were or like having these like inherently like say for example misogynistic views. We are changing that and making it more culturally relatable for more audience so that this is more widespread, right? Now
Point of
moving
information.
on, one preemption before I move on to my point that like I feel like what opposition is most likely to say is that faithful adaptations preserve the original intent. I think the original intent is already preserved in its novel itself, and so the book already exists. Nobody is erasing that. And second, this argument assumes that the original perspective is somehow neutral or sacred, right? It is not. These novels came from specific social worlds, and many of those worlds were deeply unequal. This brings me back to the POI asked previously, right? So preserving that lens as the dominant norm just means preserving the authority of one historical viewpoint over all others. And third, the adaptation is in like interpretation anyway, right? The second you cast actors, cut scenes, true soundtrack, or like shift emphasis, you already are making like choices. And so opposition's neutral like preservation is probably not really possible or plausible to be 100% true. Now moving on to my first point about how experimental adaptations make classical novels relatable across cultures because they translate conflict instead of just like preserving the distance between different cultures, right? Three layers to this then. I think that number one, a lot of opposition will talk as if classics are automatically universal. They are not, right? Yes, they may deal with themes like love, ambition, shame, etc., but those themes come packaged in very specific social codes. The old language, the old institution, the old marriage markets, etc. And so for many audiences, specifically in different countries, classes, or generations, those details technically just create emotional distance, right? And so the audience does not fail to care because they're shallow. And most of the time, they fail to care because the adaptation asks them too much to do too much historical decoding before they can actually get to the emotional core or to actually get to the emotional intent. And that is the problem with like this kind of like remaining the entire old thing because it just treats
Point
kind
of
of like
information.
more distance. I won't be taking any more POIs. And number two, then I think that like there's an experimental adaptation just allows each society to localize the same conflict into its own world, right? I think this is where our side wins and where we are exclusive. That when creators relocate the story into a new context, they allow audiences to immediately understand what is at stake, right? For example, maybe the original novel was about class discipline in like the 19th century of England. Like a modern adaptation can translate that into like elite schools, caste, race, or like etc. And so this really just changes depending on the society. And so that is powerful because people are no longer just studying other societies' trauma, they're actually recognizing their own. And so once people recognize their own world inside the story, they do not just consume it, they're able to argue with it, feel it, and use it, right? And number three, then, that if the dominant norm is like a faithful adaptation, then in many societies, classics remain prestigious, but like really alienated. And that people are told that these stories matter, but then the stories do not feel like they belong to them, and it's not relatable. And the impact here is that in our world, classical novels actually circulate across time and across societies as living ideas, and in their world, they remain stuck in their original historical packaging. Moving on to my second point, then, I feel like that experimental adaptations break the old gatekeeping of like the canon, and also like allows deeper and more intersectional discussions of humanity, right? Two things here. Number one, I think let's be blunt, that classical literature doesn't float like from a place like heaven, and that it was historically shaped by male authors, male publishers, male critics, male academics, etc. And that even when women wrote classics, they often wrote under severe social constraints. And that female desire, labor, anger, or sexuality and autonomy were restricted. So even the texts we now praise are often shaped like inside these deeply unequal worlds, and that means the faithful adaptation just kind of preserves the plot, meaning that they preserve this kind of hierarchy and oppression, and in other words, this is just really like lack of respect for the people now. And number two, we think that this matters because the human experience is not singular, right? So when you experimentally adapt a classic, you can ask, where should we change it now? Where should we turn it more fair? And so this often reproduces the original hierarchy of the attention, but then the same people remain central and the same silences remain silent. However, once we have this kind of experimental adaptation, it can reveal what looks like we can create more equal grounds where people are more equal and like out for discussion. Proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker, if you took someone's university thesis, changed half the arguments, rewrote the conclusion, put your own name next to it, and made millions of dollars, most people would call that disrespectful. Apparently, if the original author has been dead for 200 years, we call it an experimental adaptation. I suspect if Emily Bronte rose from the grave and watched filmmakers completely rewrite Wuthering Heights, her first thought would not be, what a bold creative vision. It would probably be, that's not what I wrote. That is why we are proud to propose. I would note that this debate is comparing a world with experimental adaptations as the dominant norm to a world where true to the book adaptations are. This debate, therefore, is not about whether one side supports creativity and the other one does not. Both approaches require creativity, and both seek to bring literacy works to new audiences. The central question is, what should we value more when adapting books? Preserving the author's original vision or allowing creators greater freedom to reinterpret it? Our side believes that when adapting a book, preserving the original vision should be the priority. So, what have they said so far? Firstly, they said that it is more relatable. Two responses to this. Firstly, I would note that historical novels are still relatable, and values are still similar and easy to understand. That's why historical fiction is so compelling. Two, I would also like to note that setting isn't what we are talking about. We are talking about themes and characterization, so that's actually irrelevant anyways. So their second point was that they said they would change views and it is respectful. Note that the info slide says themes they have to defend their side are not rebuttal info slides. It's hard to understand, so they don't really care. So note that that's literally not what they are defending. The info slide gives examples. As you can provide several examples where people do understand and care. And also note that the values are still relevant, and in the same way, experimental still exists when it's too crazy. I'll now begin on my first point. So many of the novels that are adapted today are the life works of authors who are no longer alive. They cannot give permission for major changes, nor can they defend the messages they intend to convey. This creates a special obligation on filmmakers. If we are using another person's work to gain profit recognition and cultural relevance, no, thank you. We should adapt that work in a way the author would reasonably have approved of. This is not simply a question of legal rights. It is a question of artistic respect. Authors spend years developing themes, characters, and narratives. Sure, I'll take it.
If the copyright of Jane Austen has gone away for 99 years because the international law cuts it for 99 years, why couldn't we have the right to adopt it? The copyright is no longer available.
My second speaker will answer this POI. So authors have spent years developing themes, characters, and narratives to communicate a specific message. The success of these books are not accidental. The themes resonate because the different parts of stories work together to express a particular vision of the world. Experimental adaptations often break this relationship by changing the themes, motivations, or outcomes of the story. When this happens, the author's message is no longer carried forward. Take the example of the novel North and South. The book is not merely a romance. It explores class conflict, industrialization, and the tensions between social groups in the Victorian era. A faithful adaptation preserves these ideas and introduces them to a new audience. By contrast, an overly experimental adaptation risks reducing the story to only its romantic elements and losing the themes that made the original work significant. The same can be said for Wuthering Heights. The novel explores feminism in a particular way. An adaptation that dramatically alters the themes or characterizations may still be entertaining, but is no longer faithfully carrying the ideas that Emily Bronte intended to communicate. This is why I believe that there is an intrinsic obligation to authors. Their works are not merely intellectual property that filmmakers can reshape at will. These books represent years of creativity, effort, and artistic intention. If adaptations wish to benefit from the popularity and prestige of these stories, they should also bear the responsibility of preserving them. This should be weighed highly, as it is not only principally harmful, but would also offend fans of the original work, leading to significant practical harms stemming from this as well. Now, onto my second point. True adaptations create higher quality media. Opposition will likely argue that experimentation allows filmmakers to be more creative. We disagree. The reason books become classic is because the stories have already stood the test of time. No, thank you. I will not be taking any more POIs. Their plots are coherent, their characters are memorable, and their themes resonate across generations. When filmmakers remain faithful to these elements, they build upon an already strong foundation. Experimental adaptations often take unnecessary risks. Major changes to the plot or character can create inconsistencies, weaken the emotional impact of the story, and alienate audiences who love the original work. In trying to make the story their own, filmmakers sometimes lose the qualities that made the book successful in the first place. True adaptations avoid this problem. They preserve the beloved characters as audiences know them. They recreate iconic scenes that readers have imagined for years. They allow audiences to relive emotions that they experienced when reading the book while experiencing those moments in a new medium. This creates a stronger emotional payoff than experimental adaptations ever could. Fans are not simply watching a movie, they are seeing a cherished story brought to life. This is illustrated by the highest grossing adaptation of all time, No Country for Old Men, being a true to the novel adaptation. If filmmakers want to tell a different story, they should create an original work. If they choose to adapt an existing book, they have an obligation to preserve the themes, messages, and artistic vision that made that book so meaningful in the first place, as well as practical incentives to do so. Thank you.
What do you think of when you talk about classical novel? For you, it might be Jane Austen and Emily Bronte. For me, it might be Journey to the West or The Legacy of Lu Xun. But a common we share is that our personal connection to these classical novels makes the classics important to us. The cultural identity underlying such a novel is what we really care about. So when it comes to the biggest question in this debate, as we have already stated in the first speech outside proposition, what is the framing of this debate? The biggest question in this debate is not whether experimental is high quality or other original ones is high quality one. It's not about experimental the way itself. It's more about how whoever could bring the public's attention back to classic novel. Whoever could create more discussion so that classical novels could continue to live in people's heart, not just on paper, whoever who can make the classical novels evergreen, so that a cultural legacy of the whole humanity could be prolonged, could be continued, could be preserved in the value of people. I'll take the POI after the first part of my speech, and therefore I'd like to divide my speech into 3 parts. The first part is some adding to the characterization. The second, basic responses. And the third, one piece of extension about a solidified stereotype that we have to break. Firstly, I'd like to add on to the characterization provided by the first speaker of proposition. Proposition's first speaker characterized the motion very clearly by saying that faithful adaptations shouldn't be banned. Our side, people are still having a choice in it. The only difference is that we're creating it as a more dominant norms that can coexist with other norms. The dominance is very important. This is how we justify it. One, the stereotypes of the classical novel is serious literature is so solidified that we have to change it. And this will be further explained in my extension. But more importantly, human beings have so many heritages. So the stereotype is so solidified, and we have to take the scale. The scale should be guaranteed. And this is why the dominance role of this norm, of this new norm, should be the main part, should be the main shape of our discussion. But we're not killing diversity. Diversity is still largely preserved because social media paves pathway for people's different choices. The only thing is that we're just prioritizing the dominant role in it without giving people any pressure to choose on them. And therefore, I'd like to add on to the second piece of characterization. Classical novel in the status quo is losing attention in the status quo. Alternative media, such as social media, funny videos on YouTube, and internet novels, all of these new literatures and medias are getting people's attention away. New kids are no longer willing to read the long novel of Jane Austen. They're no longer willing to study into the Pride and Prejudice or so. They're simply focusing everyone of their attention on some funny memes on YouTube or so. This is the status quo because classical novel is losing attention is the main question we'd like to answer in this debate, in their framing. Whoever can bring the public's attention back to the classic novel is the key point in this debate. But how can we bring that attention to the novel? This is the last piece of characterization which will make the complete argument of our motion, is that no adaptation is actually objective. But controversy is good on our side because the original copy, while the original copy of the book is still there, human beings can still have a lot of choices to adapt it. Different narratives of retelling a story can be creative, can be high quality, and it doesn't mean that it is completely low quality. Therefore, but we create a lot of controversy, right? Why is controversy good? Because our main logic is controversy exists a lot in adaptation that are experimental. However, discussion is going to involve both the loyal readers of the original copies and the movie lovers, the supporters of experimental ones. We're actually embracing the diversity of discussion within this controversy. When the controversy can bring more, I'll take it later, bring it later into the discussion, the discussion will center again on the original book, and people's curiosity are raised, and they will go back to the original copy and study them more. And invite people back to the books, we're winning the basic criteria and answering the question of best. The former response is, yes, POI, please.
So, since you mentioned Monkey King earlier, I would like to ask you whether you prefer the original TV show adaptation of Journey to the West or Monkey Magic.
Just the reason I don't prefer the new TV series is the reason we're winning this debate. Because controversy is good based on the logic. Controversy is bringing discussion to this debate. When controversy is existing, I am a loyal protector of Monkey King's original paper. I'm going to involve into the discussion and tell the others and debate with them how the original work is better. And therefore, people's attention will be centered around Monkey King, right? The culture identity could be revived, and the classic could live in people's minds forever. Moving on to the rebuttal and the responses to our opponent's points. Our opponents characterize the debate as the credits going to the director. I'm not taking any more POI, going to the director and making money with that original book. I don't think it is necessarily true because, copyright has lost availability after tens or hundreds of years for Jane Austen and Emily Bronte. It is the rights of them, this right of modern freedom of speech to adapt it in a rather creative way. It is no way that you argue it on principle on your side that this is totally wrong. But more importantly, our characterization is more likely because we fulfill the goal of continuing the legacy of the whole humanity. Furthermore, they argue about the artistic respect thing. They argue that it is immoral to adopt the original works. Adding on to the copyright response, I'd like to add 2 more things. The first is that faithful adaptation faces the same issue. Actually, you have to prove why this is the exclusive argument on your side, because there is no completely objective adaptation. It is only that our controversy is greater and our controversy is bringing more attention than yours. Secondly, its controversy brings attention more. And secondly, I'd like to add more responses to our opponent's argument about high-quality media foundations. Firstly, they have to argue why this argument is exclusive. No, this argument is not exclusive. Adaptations are only creatively retelling the story or changing the value, but the fundament is still largely original. Secondly speaking, our experimental adaptation doesn't mean low quality. It could also have some literary values. It could also have a very, very great director like Nolan, like other directors that are great. Move on to the extension very quick. We break the solidified stereotype on classical novel as serious literature. 3 premises. Firstly, how these images form. Back in the old times, people reading those novels are regarded as well educated. Nowadays, the ones that can recite excerpts from Jane Austen's books are regarded as elegant and pedantic. This is a historical issue. Second, creative adaptation, experimental adaptations, blend some pop culture, speak the logic in a more acceptable way, and makes the environment and context chill. For example, I might say on a dinner table that Annie Hathaway is acting the role of Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice in a funny way. This is completely chill, right? It's not serious. Thirdly, dominant norm. People accept it and more thoroughly and ensures the feasibility on our side. When people shift the pattern in discussion and center on the classics, stereotypes could be a lot cut, and classics are objectively viewed by on-time values and become evergreen. 3 impacts. Firstly, we're making children and students accept the classics more willingly. Secondly, we're making the diversity of speech broader because it is no longer the authority of Jane Austen or Emily Bronte in the discussion of literary context. The last thing to say, we're breaking the old social norms of hierarchy and male-dominated dialogue symbolized by these stereotypes in a length of history so that our cultural legacy could be more healthy and adaptable to the new era to come. All positions simply rule out every one of these possibilities to maintain a better legacy for the people, to maintain a better cultural identity for the people, and preserve the beautiful image of Jane Austen, of Emily Bronte, of whatever it is to the people themselves. And therefore, we're so proud to propose the motion.
Side proposition tries to tell you in this debate that they're the side that will break free of a male-dominated historical hierarchy. So let me ask you this. When Emily Bronte wrote her 1847 novel, Wuthering Heights, under the pen name of Ellis Bell, because she couldn't find publication under a true female name. And when she wrote a story reflective of her personal experiences, featuring protagonist Heathcliff as a feminist who fights these very social and hierarchical norms in her novel that went on to influence literature forever. And then when Emerald, I've got the name of the director of Wuthering Heights, but when she came along and made a movie which featured Margot Robbie and protagonist Heathcliff as an absolute sex bomb, showing intimacy scene after intimacy scene, disregarding the original plot, and consistently showing only content that would further these very hierarchical, male-dominated historical stereotypes. Do you really think that they can claim to be the side that breaks free of these historical stereotypes? I think not. Okay, before my rebuttal, just a couple of clarifications. They tried framing experimental adaptations as those which would preserve the original story and message, when this isn't true. They tried to frame it as a reinterpretation, but the fact is, experimental adaptations are transformations, not reinterpretations, and that's the key point here. They can't reap the benefits of it being an actual artistic reinterpretation, when in reality, the info slide clearly states that these shift and deviate meaningfully from the core values present in the original novels. Furthermore, they tried stating that people wouldn't be able to have access to this media and these content, and that these movies would get it out there more. The fact is, this just isn't true. Let's look at Wuthering Heights again as an example. This is only available via Netflix, whereas these books that are the copyright has expired are now on the Gutenberg Project and in the accessible to the public. And so people already have accessibility to this. And so now the only remaining barriers to entry are those of, I'll take you later, are those of first of all, language barriers and difficulty understanding classical language. Now, this is symmetrical on our side. With faithful adaptations, we achieve this. And second of all, while correlating to these original messages. Now, while I do agree that in some capacity, experimental adaptations can increase their ability to broader society to understand the message, these novels are classical by the sheer fact that they've preserved this message for thousands or hundreds of years. This is what makes them classical, and it's these novels that are so well written that people are able to understand them so well, regardless of their position in life. And furthermore, they tried framing these books as falling out of favor, and that people aren't reading them as much, and so it's important to get them out there. Now, first of all, I just want to say that this is symmetrical on our side. A new movie, if it's a faithful adaptation, will still get these bonuses, like the Harry Potter series, or like we said earlier, No Country for Old Men. But furthermore, these historical novels are already being studied in schools, and when they use social media as an example of why they're falling out of fashion, I actually think that helps our side. Social media increases the spread of opinions. There are very, very many accounts out there on Instagram that discuss these classical novels, and it's actually reinvigorated a lot of discussion about the classics.
Why?
I'll take you now. Yeah, sure.
So social media is parallel on our side as well. But if the author's meaning must always be preserved, then why adapt at all instead of just tell people to read the book?
And great. So, first of all, social media isn't parallel on your side. That's actually two questions, but I'll answer both. Social media isn't parallel, or it doesn't matter. Sorry, it is parallel, but it doesn't matter because you used it as an argument. So, I'm just saying it is parallel. So, that doesn't make any sense. But to answer your second question about why not tell people to read the book, this is the exact reasons I mentioned earlier. It gets faithful adaptations. More people experience it, more people will see it. So we essentially have more people seeing the author's original message, whereas on your side of the house, we see more people seeing a flawed or altered message. So to return back to the example I gave earlier with Wuthering Heights, this was originally a feminist novel about destroying this male-dominated society, and then the movie adaptation just got rid of all of this. About the only things they kept were the same names and the names of characters, and yet the director, Emerald, exploited this novel and made millions of dollars and gained international fame as a result of this movie, while not actually propagating any of Emily Bronte's original messages. Okay, but why does this matter so much? Well, we tell you that, first of all, these authors are long since deceased. We can no longer get their permissions. Now, we heard in a POI, and I'll respond to this now, that why does it matter if we're using these things if they're not copyrighted? If the copyrights run out. I'm actually going to ask you another question here. Is it wrong for us to use works that aren't copyrighted? A university paper isn't copyrighted, but if I rewrite the same thing word for word, that's still plagiarism and it's still wrong. Furthermore, plagiarism and these laws don't necessarily dictate what's right and wrong. If a book, let's say we take a book like Wuthering Heights, it's hundreds of years old, and then I write some crazy smart fan fiction yaoi, then clearly we're not actually preserving the original message here, and this is going to be harmful for the author's message. Okay, but onto more details about why this is actually wrong. Because these very works of art embody the author's worldviews. They're representative of the times and experiences, and we've even heard this down the bench on their side. So radically shifting them and changing them, as the info slide states, core values, is detrimental to the way people understand and perceive this author, and furthermore, it spreads a pertinent message that these authors likely don't agree with. Next, there's an ethical duty, because these authors spent a lot of time working on these novels. These are their, oftentimes in a lot of cases, like in Emily Bronte's case, they're ultimate magnum opus. And so by reinterpreting it, you're inherently transforming under your side rather than reinterpreting. And the danger here is that when you start transforming these works, in some cases, the only thing that stands as the same is just the name. And when that becomes the case, we're now slandering these authors and going against the artistic values they further desired. Now, next, when these authors wrote their books, for example, when Emily Bronte wrote her book, it was to cause change. Wuthering Heights was designed to attempt to shift these societal standards away from male-dominated society. However, the movie has only further propagated these very standards, and so we've actually seen work against what the author originally desired. It is implicitly clear from her book that she wants to fight these stereotypes, except the movie propagates them. So it goes against her message, and it will this even comes to practical harms because it'll disincentivize actually writing books in the first place. And so overall, I think for all of those reasons, it's very, very clear that these unfaithful and random adaptations that only keep the name exploit these books for fame and money whilst not actually preserving any of the core messages. And for those reasons, among many more, I'm very, very proud to oppose.
Do not let opposition take us at our worst case. The value brought to classical novels does not lie in saying put, pure, and true to exactly every single page and every single word that it dictates. When something is already a symbol of culture, time, and history, its value lies in the innovation and new ideas that the human spirit entrusts it with. Look at Shakespeare, look at Jane Austen, look at the only example they gave us throughout their entire speech, which is Wuthering Heights, right? these are already interpreted, read, judged. There are millions of different things, millions of different web pages that you can find on social media or find when you go on searching. And people majorly have the same morals. People majorly have the same thoughts on what exactly it expresses, right? So if you are an audience member that is extremely faithful to the original series or to the original book, we are not stripping away any choices that you originally have. Furthermore, we would also like to add that a lot of these like classical novels already have extremely faithful adaptations, right? Like we don't see
POI.
Yes.
Do you think the vast majority of these audience members rewatching these unfaithful adaptations are going to be the people who have read the novels and the people who understand its original message, or do you think it'll be people who this is their first interpretation of the author's works?
We believe that in either case, because people are getting their attention, we make people understand that this stems from something that is a creation of this author, and when their attention is grabbed, when controversy is present in society, and when they want to make up their mind for themselves, they will be more inclined to see what other people are doing, what other people are talking, and why other people hold their values as such, and therefore they will be more inclined to re-indulge and investigate for themselves about and decide for themselves what exactly does this book or what exactly does this novel actually bring to them. And we
Point
believe
of
that this
information.
no, I would not be taking until after the 5th minute. And until this point, it truly gives you the value of reading a novel. It truly gives you the additional benefit to society of reading a novel, because we believe that the true essence, how literature brings to our societal life, is the value and the happiness that you gain from reading it, right? Okay. Moving on. And also they tell you that some of these adaptations will be extremely radical, and basically they use this point as to take up our worst case scenario and basically use this to rebut our entire case. But we tell you that this premise is false. We tell you that it's because these filmmaking companies, they are profit driven, and at the end of the day they care about their own feedback, they care about how much views they get, and they care about their own profit, and they care about having jobs that will not get laid off by their boss. Because of all these reasons, they have the incentive to be careful, to relate to the what audience really likes, and to actually change novels into things that are less radical but more like being accepted by the common people and being more accepted as time goes on. So this will look like more giving, like, destroying stereotypes and adding on, for instance, like incorporating black people into their cast members, instead of really doing what our opposition says about doing very radical like transfigurations and making things go very outlandish, right? So we believe that at the end of the day, it will not be an extreme scenario that our opposition assumed the world to be, and instead, because everyone in this case is sort of rational, and if they uphold a societal belief to be that if they assume their level to be extremely high upon, they can actually do things to incorporate and do things to actually understand what this novel is talking about, then at the end of the day, the dominant norm in the status quo will not be extremely radical, but instead will be something that more or less the audience member will accept. Okay, but then going on to clear about one of the most important clashes of this debate, and that is what exactly controversy brings to the status quo, right? We believe that, again, what our second speaker has already mentioned, is that the attention of the controversy itself will bring attention to these classical novels, but this is renewed attention. As we already mentioned, like, there are a lot of faithful choices that if you're really just wanting to stick to the exact words and exact pages of what this novel gives you, we will not be stripping away any of your choices, right? The renewed attention that we're bringing appeals mostly, for instance, to young people, for people who want to discover something new, for people who want to incorporate something new into social values, and people who believe that the original film industry is already, for instance, extremely corrupt and extremely like lagging behind, right? So the people who are attracted to read the novels and to watch the films, there will be people who support the original films. There will be people who don't, right? But anyways, it's because of the fact that there are conversations between these two. It's because of the fact that there will be controversy. It's because, therefore, the fandoms and the audience members of these films and these novels will increase overall, and this will break the deadlock of people only reading classical novels in like classrooms and then doom scrolling for the rest of their lives, right? So I think that at the end of the day, it's because of controversy and because the fact that as human beings, as society, we have a tendency to be drawn to things that are creating scandals. We have this tendency to be drawn to things that are getting a lot of attention, so therefore more people will be able to stand on both sides, and this
Point of information.
like diversity. Yes.
Do you think that these types of adaptations that would be creating vast amounts of controversy would be detrimental to the author's message, as it would like exacerbate misinterpretations and transformations of the original piece?
First of all, if you listen to my clarification, I have already made it extremely clear that because filmmaking industries are profit driven, there will not be so much as like scandalous, as a scandalous controversy. And secondly, what we're talking about in this case is controversy that will be kept to more or less a conservative point. And we believe that in this healthy kind of conversation, the fact that you are arguing for people who are already dead to come back and utilize their minds as evidence for how you should win this debate, obviously you believe that even though, like, you gave the example of Wuthering Heights, right? So let's use this example. Like, if you dislike the film, did that actually decrease your respect for the original author and to original merit? We don't believe so, right? And so you're asking us whether, for instance, a very bad film will make me decrease my merit or decrease like my respect towards this author. You on yourself said that you dislike this new film, Wuthering Heights, but then if you're still arguing from the perspective of dead Emily Bronte, then we believe that, well, your respect for this author has not decreased, right? So, and then moving on to another clarification that we would like to point out is that they assume that, again, all of these new and radical films will be the first thing that makes people dislike these films, will be the first thing that introduces these people to classical novels. They assume that these classical novels are something that people have never seen before, or never heard before, or do not know the actual morals. However, in a normal upgrowth, we believe that more or less people has already been understanding about how these films or how these novels have an impact to their life. And it's because the fact that there is already a foundational build-up on how society works, therefore, proposition wins this debate.
It's funny how they call us uncharitable for assuming that adaptations that aren't true to the novel are not true to the novel. Because like this debate, like the info slide is literally about change in core themes. That's literally like what the info slide said. And so I think the fact that they're saying that their worst case scenario is the literal info slide is just like kind of humorous. But anyway, two main issues. Firstly on practical quality and secondly on principal justification. First on practical quality then. So what have we told you on this? We've told you that there's going to be A, a better media foundation, and B, that people will be less likely to like the less like true to the novel adaptations. So firstly on media foundation then, they just try to symmetricize this by saying that the foundation will be there on either side, and the director can just choose to use it. I don't think that the directors are always going to be making perfect decisions on this. Like, they won't make perfect creative choices, and I think their assumption on that with basically zero mechanization just shows that they probably haven't properly justified this, right? I think that the directors will often be using this for their own motives to present their own message, which probably will clash with the original vision of the author somewhat. And the fact the info slide literally requires us to assume this, and so I think this still largely stands. Okay, secondly, we talked about how people some people won't like it. They tried to flip it with controversy, which I will talk about later. But I would also note that people not liking the film, well, actually, never mind. Okay, so what have they told you on this? They told you that because people don't watch classics anymore, they're just going to basically, it's just going to bring attention to the classics. I would also note that people still don't watch classics anymore on their side. Instead, they just have an unfaithful adaptation, which we did talk about in a POI, being actually bad for the vision, because it's going to be just telling them that I don't know, over-sexualizing characters, when in reality we're meant to be talking about the feminist messaging underneath, which is basically counterproductive when we are thinking about the over-sexualization. They also talk about how there's going to be a more progressive legacy from this, and I think largely this topic isn't really about replacing a background character with a black person. It's about whether we actually change the underlying message. I think in reality, making the actor for Snow White black probably would change the underlying message, but I don't really see how adding dwarf actors into the Snow White movie would really change anything, or using CGI. Either way, basically just that is still going to remain very much true to the original message. Okay, they're also contradicting themselves at third with the classics thing by saying that a lot of people have seen the original, when we talked about how not a lot of people have seen the original, which I thought was kind of funny. But I think largely, basically the majority of people haven't. They actually mechanized this pretty well themselves. So people haven't really seen the original. Their interpretation is going to come solely from the unfaithful adaptation for the majority of people, which means that we can still claim this point. Okay, so secondly, on principal justification, I think this is perhaps a more important issue just due to the fact that they didn't particularly impact the practical quality. Sure, like some people might be slightly more happy when they watch the movie, but I think this is significantly outweighed by the fact that we are like blatantly disrespecting the view of the author, which we have like mechanized quite a bit. They just try to respond to artistic respect. I'll take you in a bit with like copyright. I don't see how this responds to it on a principal level. They also try to symmetricize with how like they're just like not going to be like they're still adaptations. I think that the info slide requires us to believe that there are some adaptations that are true to the vision of the author, which means that I think this is just responded to by the info slide itself. So therefore, I think this point still stands as they simply haven't responded to this on the principal level. Okay, I'll take you.
Isn't the info slide literally premised on a meaningful deviation from core elements? So why are you acting as if it changed themes, like if changed themes are some unfair characterization from our side?
Okay, so what I was saying there was that basically when it's true to the novel, right, it's going to keep all the core themes the same. When it's not true to the novel, it's going to change the core things. Core themes. They give the examples that we are actually using in our case. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, oh yeah, they tried to say that they would like still respect the authors with like the adaptation. Yeah, still, I think largely the info slide requires us to interpret it as it being possible for these adaptations to not be like the author's original vision. They gave us the example of Wuthering Heights, which we did use. There are other examples. I think like the example that I gave about Monkey Magic, which you guys like talked about, I think was also like a pretty good example of how it's like deviating from the core themes, right? This is going like this deviation is generally pretty bad. I don't think you guys have refuted like the badness of our
Why?
examples, and you guys haven't really provided any counter examples. And so I think at least in these cases, which are basically the cases that this debate is about, this still stands. No, thank you. I might take you in a bit. Okay, let's talk about the controversy point because they tried to make this quite a big thing. This is actually, I think I would like to flip this because this is actually the wrong kind of attention. I did also touch on this earlier, but it's literally a misinterpretation of the original. If you're looking at it and you're assuming that the original is basically just going to be like the movie adaptation, it's just going to be significantly like worse, right? You're going to think that you understand the original when you don't understand the original, which means you're even less likely to actually read the novel because it's like irrelevant, and you're even less likely, even if you do read the novel, to take what the novel was meaning to give you, right? Like into account. Okay, yeah, I'll take you. 13 seconds left.
If directors sometimes make bad creative choices, why does that justify a norm of restriction rather than simply judging bad adaptations as that just being bad?
I don't think restrictions are particularly relevant. We're not restricting. We're just saying that the majority, like norm, is that the people will be true to the novel versus like people not being true to the novel. I don't think this is a policy debate. Anyway, okay. Lastly, they talk about how like the directors will be profit driven, and so they won't want to be scandalous, and so they won't want to. They will want to keep it like true to the novel. I think this is again like sort of against the premise of the debate. But you literally just said like attention is good, right? You just said that scandals are good. So basically, I think there will still be profit, like motive, to make like these things that aren't true to the original like novel, right? Just because of all the mechanisms that you have given us. Okay, so anyway, on weighing, I think we should like weigh principal justification significantly higher, just due to the fact that this is actually like a very significant principal harm, while the practical quality is just a few people like are just going to be happier. I think like in reality, respecting like a dead author is going to be more important than like a few people having a bit of fun in the cinemas, right? Okay, that's about it. Proud to whichever side I'm on.
If I had to sum up the opposition's case in three words, I would say uncharitable and contradictory. They tried telling you that they tried taking down our substantive by saying filmmakers are incentivized to create a faithful adaptation, whilst also claiming they're incentivized to create scandal and by misrepresenting the core messages. They contradicted themselves again by saying many people have seen the original in response to a POI, while saying these classics are falling out of favor and no longer viewed. And they tried saying that we took them at their worst case scenario, when in reality, their worst case scenario is literally the topic slide. Wuthering Heights is the first thing stated in the info slide, and even if you don't buy that, it literally says, and I quote, meaningfully deviating from core themes and messages. So you can't just say that's not the case. Okay, anyways. So they claimed, last thing I just want to clarify, they claimed in a POI that we're trying to restrict the these other filmmakers. This just like isn't the case. At no point did we ever say we wanted to restrict them. And furthermore, they tried saying that the fact that these people would be disincentivized because they'll be like judged for these bad, unfaithful remakes. Unfaithful doesn't mean poor quality. It just means not representative of the original. And so, like, ultimately speaking, this point doesn't hold any water because they're not being judged. They're judged based on quality, not on faithfulness to the original. Okay, so down to I think the single most important thing in this debate, and that's whether we weigh the principal point of disrespecting the artist's original message over whether we over the like practical benefits of spreading this message out more with more people hearing it, right? So first of all, I just want to say outline our team's case and our best path to victory, which is this principle. So we've told you down the bench the main problem with these unfaithful adaptations, along with other practical harms, is that they're not representative of the author's original message. They tried claiming that we didn't give enough examples when we did give multiple. Monkey Madness was brought up earlier, as well as The Shining, which the author of The Shining actually stated that he hated the movie as it wasn't faithful. Fight Club, there are many, many more examples that I couldn't think of, but still, like, that's just a game example tennis, so I'm going to actually provide you mechanisms unlike them. So, we've heard mechanisms down the bench that, necessarily speaking, these films aren't going to be faithful adaptations. Filmmakers aren't generally incentivized to make faithful adaptations like they conceded themselves with their points on scandalous creations, disrespecting the author's messages, being incentivized as it gets more attention and publicity. And so ultimately, we've heard very few responses from them, mainly that, like, what's the point? Their biggest response here was, what's the point if copyright is diminished? I already responded to that, but I'll do it again. We've heard, like, down the bench that, first of all, copyright laws, like, aren't necessarily indicative of artists' original message. Just because something's one day after the expiry date of copyright laws doesn't mean, like, it's the fact that you shouldn't plagiarize, it just falls off a table. We've also gave you mechanisms at second, that these unfaithful remakes are bad because they, like, change the values. For example, in Wuthering Heights, I know I keep bringing. Actually, no, I'll do a different one. In Fight Club, the original message in the film was how we should be rebellious and not stick into the standard, like, 9-to-5 work life. However, in the film adaptation, it was a completely different message, with them stating how we should, stick to this very central themes, and that rebellion was bad. And lastly, they tried denying that filmmakers have any ethical duty whatsoever to represent the original. This just factually isn't true. We heard that at first. By the way, anyways, so I responded to this at second, saying that since these are reflective of their worldview, furthermore, it disincentivizes book creation if you're, like, slandering the authors. And lastly, works are inherently, people put effort into that, and so misrepresenting them is harmful, and they shouldn't do it. And we rate this incredibly highly throughout this debate, as ultimately you can like make any movie. So if you're gonna go out of your way to exploit these original books and profit off of them, you should be representing them accurately, and it should be something the authors approve of. Lastly, they tried to strawman us, saying we were talking about, like, dead authors. That's, like, a metaphor that has nothing to do with the topic. All right, thank you very much. Proud to, oppose, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I tell you Jane Austen is inferior and I don't want to respect her anymore, do you feel offended? Yes, you do, because I am violating your greatest cultural identity. But cultural identity is the subject of this debate, which is the greatest question that we would like to answer. But what you're defining this is a scandal. This is not what we are defending. What we are defending is a healthier controversy, is a healthier discussion centering around the adaptation, with the premise that we both sides respect Jane Austen, and we are only discussing the context based on. The loyal readers of Jane Austen will very likely think that experimental adaptations are bad. And the movie lovers So there will be debates, there will be discussions, controversy, but everything has a premise that we all respect the author, that we all respect the classic itself. And that is why I'd like to present 3 things in my speech to defend why proposition is the side we are proud to take. The first is some moral issues on opposition. First thing, opposition is allowing the outdated stereotypes and hierarchy in culture to prolong. Second, they're letting go a better chance to preserve cultural identities in a more healthy way for the whole Earth in general, which our side very possibly and more likely is going to conserve on our characterization of the motion as the classical novels losing the likelihood of attention. But more importantly, even if you don't buy this, they still face the ultimate issue that is irresolvable. They're letting people losing their attention on classical novels. And by saying that, we're not saying that every single person is losing that. We're just saying that in the future, in the long run, especially the young people with more interest on alternative media, they are the ones that are the targets and main stakeholders within this debate that we need to preserve on. And these 3 questions are left unanswered on your side of the opposition, and therefore we're taking that on a moral high ground. But even if you don't buy this, we can still take back the materials, which is the second part of this reply speech, the main logic and main impacts of each side of the house. Opposition's main logic is that they can better defend the author's intention. They can better defend the author's original value. 3 things to say. First thing, proposition is not killing author's intention. The fundament is the same. The fundament is still based on the novel itself. We respect it. It's the premise of this debate. We are only sharing it in a more creative narrative, which is the basic allowance within a free speech principle. But more importantly, the second thing to say, classical novels' intentions don't need you to be defended. They are not fresh or rookie novels, ladies and gentlemen. They are the authority in the past. They are the Jane Austens and Emily Bronte that should be living in your heart. They already takes the high ground, which doesn't need further effort to be defended. So the position is very solidified, and in a future adaptation is the one we are taking. And the last thing to say, experimental adaptation is different from copying a university paper, guys. Literature is flexible in nature, while academy is objective. A director will not tell the public that a story is his stuff. Still, the creation of Jane Austen, of course, the creation of the original author. Proposition main logic is that controversy exists a lot in the discussion centering around experimental adaptation itself rather than the author. We have no controversy about the author. So discussion involving both the loyal readers and the movie lovers, the 2 stakeholders will form a balance within such debates on social media, on alternative platforms that empower the evergreen production routes for our further discussion. So the key part here, what makes it different from the side opposition is attention, is discussion, which is totally missing on opposition that they try not to defend and simply wash it away. We are inviting people back to the books, but opposition is not. Let's compare the worst case and best case scenario to end this debate. Proposition's worst case is still a discussion centering around the original literature and it become evergreen, while opposition is supporting a best case in which people still respect the authors but still have no incentive to discuss about it. The attention is still not centering about it. You're not fulfilling the main goal of this debate to let the classics be evergreen. Therefore, for the sake of the whole humanity, for the legacy of our civilization, we are so proud to propose.